6. Yeah, so anyway, hello to the Zoom people. So this event is being recorded. So if you have any violent outbursts, it's going to be captured on film and audio. I'm Denise Ward. I'm with the Friends of the Aptos Library, and I think I've seen all of you before. There isn't anybody who hasn't attended an OCR event, our community reads, right? Oh, welcome. Yay. So we're in our 8th year, and each year we pick a book and we plan programming around that book. And this year it's Flight the Computer. And if anybody would like a copy of it, we have a few copies back there for a donation of $10. So before I introduce our renowned speaker, I just want to say that there are a couple ways you can donate to our program if you're so inclined. One is if you happen to shop at Deluxe Foods, you can tell them at the register you want to support the Aptos library. And some of those proceeds then come to us. And since Cindy's in the audience, you can also support the La Selva Beach friends as well.
Thank you very much.
So by now, we've accumulated more friends groups. Aptos started this program, but now we have La Selva Beach and Felton and Capitola and Scotts Valley, and 2 new branches this year, Garfield Park and Brant's 40. So we're pretty excited about that. The other way you can donate if you're so inclined is we have a QR code on these cards that takes you to our website, to the donation page. And why do we need donations? Well, because we give honoraria to our speakers. We pay for venues. We can't always host everything in the library. So sometimes we have to pay for rentals. We pay for licensing fees for our films. We pay for some refreshments and things like that. So that's what you're supporting. Okay, so enough about that. We have Nicholas Rowell, who's here for the 4th time. And I love Nick because when I say we have this program and this is the book, and he says, how can I help? And what can I do? And people love his talk. So Nick earned his PhD in political science at the University of New Mexico in 2012. He's taught U.S. government comparative politics and international relations at Cabrillo since 2014. His research background focuses on the comparative analysis of Latin American politics, especially interactions between civil society and the state. Listen closely. His teaching emphasizes the robust civic engagement required to sustain the health of democracies. So we welcome.
Get my microphone going there. See if that's what it's working great. Thank you so much, Denise. Thank you all for being here tonight. Thank you for the warm welcome. It's a lovely turnout. Hi to everybody on Zoom. I wanted to start this evening a couple of disclaimers that I think can kind of set the stage appropriately for what I wanted to speak with you about this evening. And the first and probably the most important is that I'm not a climate scientist. And so I'm going to talk a lot about the impact of climate change in different regions around Latin America this evening. But in terms of those topics specifically, I'm an interested layperson rather than an expert. However, I have spent the last 25 years or so of my life as a scholar focusing on the politics and political development of Latin America. And so primarily my goal this evening in the presentation is a context through which we can sort of really think about the impacts of climate change, and specifically how climate change and economics in the region interact. sometimes in complicated ways, sometimes in ways that we're quite familiar with because they'll sound familiar to the California climate change experience, but in other ways that maybe are somewhat surprising. So this is my plan. What I'm going to begin with is an overview of about 6 major climate change challenges that impact different specific places in Latin America to kind of set the stage for the the broader regional experience. After that, I'm going to zoom in on a couple of more specific issues, and I'm going to focus primarily on Central America. So to begin, I wanted to point out what is maybe the sort of like biggest or most obvious climate change impact on the region. And that's, of course, the changes in sea levels that we've been anticipating for generations now, but are starting to actually happen. But the thing about sea level change is that it's not happening evenly across the globe. Some sea levels along some coastlines are rising more rapidly than others. And Latin America is actually impacted by 2 different places where the sea level is rising more quickly than elsewhere around the world. Specifically, that's along the coast of northern Brazil, and then also the Gulf of Mexico, but then extending down along the coast of Mexico as well. So as we know from our own climate change politics in California, when we talk about rising sea levels, we're not just talking. I lost my, oh, no, it's there. Sorry. We're not talking simply about like flooding. We're talking about all these second and third order consequences that come from rising sea levels. So things like contaminated aquifers of fresh water. We're talking about much more densely populated areas often with coastal cities. We're talking about greater risk of flooding and damage that comes from storm surges. And a host of other issues as well. So to begin with, sea level change. Also related, of course, to water is that Latin America is home to a huge number of glaciers along the Andean mountains. And in particular, over the last few decades, we've experienced a dramatic amount of melt in the tropical Andes, which when we talk about the tropical Andes, we're talking about the part of the Andes running from Colombia through Ecuador, Peru, and into Bolivia and the very northern part of Chile. And glacier melt there is a really big deal because it's runoff from glaciers on a seasonal basis that provide drinking water and also water for agriculture for a lot of highland communities. And so there are very serious fears about what the continued melting of those glaciers will mean for the people who live there and who live on subsistence agriculture. Okay, so we've got sea level and glaciers. In addition to that, also I think sort of familiar from an American perspective is the impact of increasing frequency and severity of hurricane season in the Atlantic. The hurricane seasons in the Atlantic in 2019, 2020, 2021, and 2023 all posted way above average total numbers of named tropical storms. 2020 being a record year with a total of 31 named storms, but in every case of those other years, there were at least 21. Those named storms frequently impact, of course, the Gulf Coast, but also Central America and then parts of Northern South America as well. But while climate change gives us too much water in some places, it gives us not enough water in other places. And different parts of Latin America have been experiencing prolonged drought as well. The most prominent of those droughts is the Central Chilean mega drought, which is now in its 16th year. It's one of the longest droughts documented in the history of the region. It's the worst in at least 1,000 years in this particular locale. And it's contributing to a large-scale water crisis for, again, agricultural purposes and drinking water purposes, but also, as we're experiencing in California, the increased risk of wildfires. So much so that there was a particularly disastrous series of wildfires just last year in Chile specifically, that resulted in 131 fatalities, and then hundreds of other folks ultimately unaccounted for. The drought. And sort of last, I think, in my kind of bigger picture overview is extreme rainfall events, which of course are often linked to those hurricanes and tropical storms, but not exclusively so. They can happen independent from those. You know, the list would go on and on and on if I were to sort of tell you major rainfall, extreme rainfall events in recent Latin American history. But two that I wanted to sort of flag to give you a sense of like some numbers and just places. Were first a series of floods in 2021 in Bahia and Minas Gerais in Brazil, so we're talking about like roughly here in Brazil, with an estimated total loss of $3.1 billion alone from a single set of floods from a single storm. But in more human terms, what those floods often do is, of course, displace people. That's our main topic this evening. And in 2017, there's a particularly noteworthy example of one of the sort of subsequent, one of the second order things that follows a major rain event, and that's of course a landslide. Again, we know this in California. Landslides are increasingly frequent, particularly in mountainous rural towns, but they can also impact urban centers as well. In 2017, there's a particularly notorious landslide in a rural southern Colombian town called Macau, in which over 400 people were killed. And I wanted to show you a photograph of the aftermath of that particular landslide. And it's...
Can you stop the screen share and then restart it? The slides are not advancing for the.
Okay, all right, I can do this. So stop the screen share?
Yeah, and then just restart it.
Okay.
Great.
Got it?
Yeah.
All right, fantastic. We're back on track. And so it's right. So it's an incredible photo, right? In part because what it reveals is when we're talking about these landslides in mountainous regions, we're not talking about just like mudslides. We're talking about huge boulders that decimate cities as they sort of tumble down a mountain. Okay, so what we've covered then so far are the kind of bigger, like different hotspots, different regions across Latin America that are impacted in different ways by climate change. But following the actual devastating changes to climate itself comes the human cost of climate change. There we go. Good, good. All right, fantastic. Which frequently shows up in terms of increased food insecurity. So not only do climate change disasters and other long-term impacts affect people's ability to make a living, they also impact subsistence farmers, and they can also have a profound impact on the price of food, depending on how a local community is integrated into a larger supply chain or the larger global economy at large. So again, just sort of examples to try to illustrate how much, what the scale of the problem we're talking about. In just the year 2021, a total of 7.7 million people across Central America, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Nicaragua, experienced higher than normal for the region levels of food insecurity. But what's particularly noteworthy about that year is how it was a year where multiple different crises were sort of overlapping and influencing each other. So it's not just food insecurity driven by climate change. It was also a year where the after effects of the COVID pandemic were still impacting people. It was specifically a year where Central America was hit by 2 different hurricanes in the same season. And this is sort of a theme that continues throughout discussions of climate change, is the way not just climate change impacts us directly, but the way climate change interacts with other problems or other crises we're already dealing with, and then magnifies them, but magnifies them the most for people on the margins of the economy and the margins of society. So 2021 was then again a difficult year in terms of food insecurity, because at the same time that was happening in Central America, in the Paraná and La Plata Basin, which is parts of Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, and Uruguay. I left it on the list. There were drought-induced damages to agriculture, reduced production, and had a direct impact on the global commodity prices for soybeans and for corn. And specifically then what that means is suddenly corn, a main staple for people across Latin America, but particularly Central America, the global price of corn increased. So now you've got people recovering from a hurricane with subsistence farms destroyed. And when you go to the market to buy what corn you can find, that corn now suddenly costs more. So when we talk about climate change, right, we're talking about food too. Okay, so specifically though, tonight we wanted to talk about the impact of climate change on migration and migration patterns. So the most recent models that I'm aware of that try to forecast how many people we expect to be displaced, to be forced to move by climate change, point to estimates of about 17 million people being forced to move somewhere else across the region by the year 2050. To put that in a sense of scale, that's a little bit smaller than the greater Los Angeles metropolitan area. So imagine all of LA picking up stakes and moving elsewhere. And in sort of regional comparative terms, 17 million people equates to about 2.6% of the entire population of all of Latin America. Now, as we sort of like looked at it when we saw those kind of different regional impacts of climate change in the region in previous slides, some regions are going to be impacted by that climate change more than others, meaning those 17 million people are going to be primarily coming from specific locations that will be increasingly identifiable as time goes on. So it won't be a region-wide problem, it will be a series of concentrated problems in different specific locations around the region. But there is one trend that we're expecting to sort of swamp all others in that movement, and that we're expecting it to primarily be the movement of people from rural areas to urban areas. And so to then make sense of how we try to get a handle on this problem, anticipate it, plan around it, figure out how to spend money on things like infrastructure, it's all about trying to mitigate damage in rural areas, but also prepare for an influx of people in urban areas, often urban areas that are not at all equipped to handle that inflow of people. So another way to think about the differences, the different regional impacts of climate change induced migration that we're expecting in the next several decades is to look at the sort of relative percentage of migration outflows for different regions across Latin America. And before these bars that I've got on this chart become misleading, what I want to point out is that this is showing the percentage of an original population in a region that then is pushed somewhere else, is forced to migrate. So these bars don't represent numbers of people, it's percentages of populations that have to leave. So in terms of percentages, we're expecting the Caribbean to be hit the hardest in terms of people leaving, followed by, this is a common acronym in my discipline, CAPDR, and that refers to Central America, Panama, and the Dominican Republic, which for sometimes economic and geographic regions, it makes sense to lump together. So second most impacted, Central America, Dominican Republic, and Panama, followed by South America, and then followed by Mexico. We're actually expecting less impact, still severe impact, but less impact in terms of migration to Mexico specifically. But when we look at that measure in terms of percentage of population forced to leave, what that's signifying to us is not like a count of human beings and therefore money needed to be spent on those human beings. It's instead a percentage of people spending money in economies who then move somewhere else and are no longer spending that money in those economies. So there's a bigger question here of what does that do to the, for example, tax base of a country or a city or a state when suddenly huge percentage of your population are moving elsewhere and spending money elsewhere and being taxed elsewhere. And for the people who study remittances, the folks who would maybe move, migrate, but then send money home, that money comes, but it doesn't make up for the amount of money that's ultimately lost from people living day-to-day lives elsewhere. Okay, but I told you I wanted to zoom in a little bit on Central America specifically, so I wanted to add one more kind of regional issue to the conversation. And my guess would be that the major climate change issues across Latin America that I listed earlier were not unfamiliar to most of us. But this one, I think, is one that doesn't get much media attention in the United States, and most folks living here at least are unfamiliar with. And it's this region that sweeps across Central America, specifically along the Pacific side, the west side, called the Central American Dry Corridor. And this part of Central America, this part shaded in purple on this map, is one of the world's regions that is most susceptible to major impacts from a changing climate. It is a climate that is already prone to periods of extreme rainfall during some times of the year and extreme drought in other times of the year. And so then as it interacts, as that normal climate pattern interacts with climate change, those two extremes just get more extreme. And when you combine that, that changing climate pattern and the extremes that are becoming more extreme with the demographics of people who live in this place, it will create a humanitarian disaster. So about 45 million people live in this area. About 40% of them are living in rural areas. So that's primarily the population we're expecting to have to migrate. Over 50% of those people live in poverty and 20% in extreme poverty. And on a regular basis, even in good years without major climate-based disasters, about 10% of people living in this region suffer from undernourishment. And so in periods of drought or flood or periods of recovery after those types of disasters, food insecurity increases even more. So we're expecting rural Central America in particular to be impacted in the next several decades by a changing climate. But then the question becomes, all right, if that happens and if people leave, where do we expect that they are most likely to go? And there's a whole cadre of like new climate modelers and demographers trying to figure out how we can model the most likely destination of people who are leaving their homes in any particular given region. And so in other words, we're trying to identify like what variables would choose someone to move to one place versus another. And what most models are increasingly showing is that folks leave rural areas, but then move to the closest big city, which is perhaps not surprising. But what that means then in more like real terms is we're expecting the population to decline in places like rural El Salvador, but then cities like San Salvador to explode in population. Cities like Tegucigalpa, cities like Guatemala City, cities like Managua. In other words, cities that are already full of very poor folks who are underserved by their states. Mexico is similar, though we're expecting slightly less dramatic climate impacts. And we're primarily expecting, or these models are primarily forecasting that the vast majority of people who will migrate away from home will be migrating away from rural South Mexico. So we're talking about places like Chiapas being the most heavily impacted. And so then we're expecting those folks to move to cities, but cities that are most reachable to them, primarily Mexico City, but then to a somewhat lesser extent, Guadalajara and Monterrey as well. So again, particularly with Mexico City, we're already talking about a mega city with over 21 million residents, suddenly dealing with a huge influx of people who don't have jobs or homes or a way to feed themselves. And then that problem gets compounded yet again because of settlement patterns that are typical, not everywhere in Latin America, but in many large cities in Latin America. And what I mean by that is typically the housing of the very poor in major Latin American cities tends to concentrate on really steep hillsides. Why? Because that's where nobody else has built yet. And so that becomes quote unquote real estate that you can squat on. And when you squat in one of those locations, you start with an improvised shelter, but then over time, if you're not removed, you build it up. So much so that many of those hillside communities at the very bottom level, the first settlers who were there have had an opportunity to better fortify their homes. And over decades, those homes at the bottom of hills are built with brick and are in pretty good shape. But then typically as you move up those hillsides, the higher you go, the more improvised the shelter is, the less secure it is, the more vulnerable it is. Meaning that all across Latin America, we're expecting people to be moving very rapidly in large numbers from the countryside to cities. They will have to find a place to live. It's more likely than not that the only place they will have to live is on these hillside communities or in floodplains that are also not currently built on. And they will be the ones at the very top of the hill. And it's at this moment that then that picture I showed you from Colombia of the landslide becomes even more meaningful. Because now the infrastructure of those hillsides matters even more. So then what are we talking about? We're talking about an enormous amount of planning that needs to go into infrastructure. Infrastructure way like beyond the infrastructure we usually are talking about with respect to climate change here in the United States, right? Like here we talk about like better dealing with climate disasters. We talk about building infrastructure around renewable energy and so on. But in Latin America, we're talking about massive infrastructure expenditures, often in communities that have never even seen infrastructure expenditures from their state before. Those hillside communities don't have traditional sewage systems. They don't have traditional sources of water. Often people are carrying water like by hand up the hill. And so an influx of people into a place that doesn't even have a starting place for infrastructure, we're talking about a massive amount of money. Okay. So that becomes the sort of like big picture impact of climate change that grabs my attention the most, I think probably just because of my academic training. But it's the way in which fiscal policy will be impacted for states across Latin America by this movement of people and these increasing climate disasters. So, for example, just natural disasters alone can reduce the GDP of a country by about 9%. And in places like the Caribbean, where the impact of, say, a hurricane can be much more severe than more inland elsewhere, we can talk about GDP being slashed by 3.6%. Those percentages, I know sound small, but what I know you also know is that those are shocks to the tax revenue of a state that come without warning. You can't plan for those, they come by surprise. So what I would ask you to do then is put yourselves in the shoes of an elected government official trying to plan the fiscal policies of their countries in these circumstances. And so what I mean by that is figuring out tax policy, but also planning government expenditures with that tax policy. How do you do that in an environment where your entire GDP can be slashed without any warning by a natural disaster? And then, even if you can somehow figure out, I don't know, like the equivalent of a rainy day fund or something like that, what you would then have to do is immediately make extremely difficult political decisions about who you will serve with your government spending. Will you spend money on wealthier communities or middle-class communities that are affected by climate change? Or will you spend the bulk of your money on poorer communities and on hillsides? And that's tricky politics. So beyond that, I think the bigger picture I'm trying to paint here is that when we talk about the human impact and the fiscal impact, and of course, political impact of a changing climate in Latin America, those impacts always come in two places. The place where people are suffering and therefore forced to leave, and wherever they go, inflow and outflow. That's further complicated by a centuries-old post-colonial pattern of problems with economic development in Latin America, where often the bulk of export earnings in Latin America come from the export of primary commodities. Primary commodities then become like a cornerstone of those economies. But because they're primary commodities, the price of those commodities fluctuate wildly on the international market, and they fluctuate in ways that are unpredictable. Meaning even before an era of climate change producing unexpected and costly natural disasters, Latin America has been struggling with underdevelopment for centuries, because you cannot rationally create fiscal policy when your economy is based on something that you cannot predict the earnings from. You don't know what your tax revenue is going to be from one year to the next. You just hope for the best and then make major adjustments accordingly. So this is just sort of an illustration of those changes in commodity prices. These are some of the highest earning, most important, for lack of a better word, primary commodity exports from the region, from Latin America. Soybeans, coffee, sugar, all impacted by changing climate. And then oil, iron ore, and copper, less impacted by a changing climate, but highly dependent on well-developed and well-maintained infrastructure to get that commodity out of the ground and then to market. So the question then becomes, what can people in our position, what can the developed world do to help mitigate some of this looming catastrophe that is beyond the reach of Latin American economies to deal with on their own? The starting point, at least in the last decade, for how we would get there was, of course, as you probably know, the Paris Agreement, right? The sort of biggest global agreement about trying to come up with the money and the plan for mitigating climate change, the effects of climate change and causes of climate change. And then one estimate by the Inter-American Development Bank came up with a sort of very wide range of numbers, saying that on the very optimistic end, Latin America would need around $470 billion coming from external sources to try to fund some of the infrastructure development and other kinds of preparation that needs to happen in the next few decades. But a more pessimistic outlook, and probably one that's frankly more realistic, is a bill somewhere in the magnitude of $1.3 trillion. So the basic idea of the Paris Agreement was to start figuring out where that kind of money would come from, and then how it could be dispersed, under what circumstances and for what kinds of situations. Well, most recently, In November of 2024, the most recent meeting of COP, which is a part of the UN. Yeah, it's a part of the UN that works on climate change issues and sort of oversees the ongoing negotiations that came out of the Paris Accord. Agreed to something that when you just look at like the lines set up on the screen is like profoundly disappointing, and that's a reasonable reaction. But was actually for climate people who say the policies of climate change, like this was a huge deal. This was an incredibly impressive promise for the future. And it was that in recognition of the fact that the bulk of climate change is driven by fossil fuels that are burned in wealthier parts of the world. But as we've seen tonight, the impact of that changing climate is going to be disproportionately felt by the global south, by the developing world. The argument has been made by the global south for decades now that the global north, rich countries need to foot the bill for at least some of the impacts of climate change that they're going to experience. Developing countries fought that tooth and nail for decades. But what COP29 represented was for the first time a global agreement in which wealthy countries, without being compelled, without being coerced, came to the agreement that they would commit to raising $300 billion a year by 2035 to then try to spend on mitigating the impact of climate change. Now, still disappointing, because in these negotiations, the number that the global south was asking for was $1.3 trillion. So keep in mind, we've seen that number before, right? The $1.3 trillion was like they go into the negotiation knowing they're not going to get it, right? We, the global south, want $1.3 trillion, but it's entirely possible that $1.3 trillion would only fit the bill for Latin America, let alone the rest of the developing world. And I said almost where the story sort of goes, but not quite is, and I'm so sorry what I'm about to do, but that's where the story goes, and it's where we are now. It's that then entered the Trump administration, and all of these interconnected problems that were being weaved together by climate change already are now being weaved even more tightly together by policies announced or adopted by the Trump administration in just the past couple of weeks. Right, so Trump immediately withdrew from the Paris Accords, meaning that $300 billion annual commitment by all of the global north, not the United States, is now very much in question. So much so that parts of the global south are already planning not to see a dime of that. Not planning is an overstatement, right? Recognizing that money may never show up. Mass deportation and and Trump's plans for stepped up immigration enforcement is also intersecting with this in very unexpected but complicated ways. As a side note, you may have seen in the news, if you follow this closely, the president of El Salvador was in the news. Anybody see this a couple of days ago? Bukele. I'm not a Bukele fan, nor will you be after you hear this. Bukele offered a few days ago to essentially make offer El Salvador's prisons as places to send folks who we are deporting with having been simply charged with a crime in the United States, regardless of that person's country of origin. In other words, his offer to the United States is you can outsource your global incarceration to El Salvador. And there is the tariff stuff happening too, where recently we saw a quick spat between the government of Colombia and the Trump administration, in which the Trump administration was using military jets to carry out deportation flights to Colombia. Colombia rejected the use of military jets for that purposes. Trump immediately threatened tariffs, and Colombia almost as quickly backed down. Meaning that a region that is already economically vulnerable, even in good times, and is increasingly economically vulnerable during times of accelerating climate change and their impacts, now has even less leverage in Trump geopolitics, in which threats of tariff are used unsparingly. So the challenge of this moment then is a challenge of figuring out how to wrap our minds around the magnitude of this problem and the magnitude of this moment in American politics, but do so without giving up to despair. I don't know the answer to that. But the reason we come to events like this tonight, and the reason I was eager to provide, it's been frankly several hours getting a presentation ready that I knew would be very depressing, is that we do not have the luxury to pretend like this stuff isn't happening, because we will be impacted by it. And we, as a country of enormous wealth, has a responsibility to figure out what our role is in confronting that. And to me, that is, if nothing else, a call to, as we all already do, vote, but vote in Democratic primaries, right? Hold Democratic candidates at every level accountable for not being completely distracted by the challenges we legitimately face in the health of our democracy, but also continue to focus on the broader picture of climate change and how it's impacting our entire world. And I think with that, that's all I need. Well, yeah, this would be a great time for, I'm happy to try to answer any questions you've got, but it's also, I think, a great time for conversation, right? This is a moment for community conversation.
I have two questions, they're not related. The first is, when you're talking about immigration around climate change, is there also another impact of like political immigration or immigration or migration due to violence or drugs?
Absolutely. Yeah. Refugee status. Yeah, absolutely. And so that becomes this whole other dimension that I didn't even put into the presentation. You're absolutely right. And climate change interacts with those complicated problems too. The one that comes to my mind most immediately is anytime you've got a scarce resource, that's a breeding ground for black markets. And black markets become a breeding ground for extortion rackets. And extortion rackets are how you fund organized crime. And so when we talk about huge regions of the world suddenly experiencing water shortages, we're talking about black markets, we're talking about extortion, we're talking about more organized crime. Of course, many other examples as well. Secondly,
It's really, what's the role of industry in all this? You know, we talk a lot about, you know, the government and politically, but as we see this movement around industry having a bigger say in what's happening around the world, what are they concerned or?
oh, they're definitely concerned. They got it. Oh, yeah. So the question was, what's the role of industry in all of this? So, what I would like to think is that there is a future in which the construction, the technology, and the overall work of adapting to climate change efficiently, quickly, is seen as an investment bonanza for industry. In other words, the problems of planning and modeling and figuring out how to do things like build better infrastructure for hillside communities becomes a great like money-making opportunity So that then the hard work of doing the planning and figuring out the technical solutions is something that industry can seize and work on. But for that to happen, it requires robust government funding for those contracts. So it ultimately will always circle back to this question of what's going on in the economy to fund a tax base. And then is that tax pay, are the elected politicians willing to take that money from the tax base and spend it on the communities most affected? Thank you, great question.
Yeah, and to go back to your earlier slide, it's my understanding that sea level rise is connected to increased severity and number of hurricanes, floods. Is that really sort of a meteorological question? You know, the global water cycle is changing because of global warming.
Yeah. So the comment here is a good one, appreciate it and thank you. Is this notion that is way beyond my expertise, but I'll repeat here, that changing conditions in the ocean, including sea level rise, also has a direct impact in increasing the frequency and severity of hurricanes.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So the Monterey Bay Aquarium, and don't worry, I am gonna give that to you, has something called a seafood watch, where they have list food, fish that are good to eat, fish that are, you wanna be concerned about, and then other fish or sea life that you just don't wanna eat. Is there anything like that for climate aware organizations or climate aware, or the climate awareness of a company that we would be able to look and see where they fit in that spectrum, and then know whether or not, or have that be part of at least a basis for us to determine if we wanted to extend our business with them?
That is a fantastic question. I'll repeat it. I don't have a great answer, but I would be really happy if there were folks in the audience who had ideas to sort of share in this conversation. The question was, are there essentially civil society groups? Are there groups of activists or monitors, outside monitors, who pay attention to companies and their record in terms of contributing to climate change or mitigating the causes of climate change? What would those organizations be? How could we find them, and what kind of information could we share with them? Folks.
Much of it is greenwashing.
Yeah.
Right?
True. And greenwashing then would inevitably become an issue there. Greenwashing meaning this idea of presenting a company like for PR reasons as being environmentally responsible, but when you look below the surface, this is not the case at all.
PG&E.
No comments. Any other question?
I could ask a million questions. This is so interesting. So one of the earlier slides again was this rural to urban migration pattern. But you were talking about people going from rural communities, large regions with rural skills.
Yeah.
Going to urban areas where those skills aren't as valued. They have to learn new skills. They're walking around the street. See people in Watsonville walking around the parking lot of La Princesa, and they're trying to sell new windshield wipers because it's raining.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So I'm going, what are the skills of those guys?
Yeah.
Racing around from car to car, trying to sell, a windshield wiper and put it on for $10 or something.
Absolutely, and then that situation, right? That has been a phenomenon in Latin America that has been sort of steadily growing since the 1960s. But we're now looking to expand much more, and we call that the informal economy, in which people without an ability to find or get typical employment instead figure out what they can sell person to person, try to get their hands on it, and then sell it in parking lots, on the side of the road, et cetera.
Yeah.
Denise?
Since you gave us a wonderful talk last year on coffee, I was wondering if you have any up-to-date information on how climate change is affecting the coffee industry. And I know I've read that it's affecting cocoa beans quite severely.
It is. Thanks for the question, Denise. The question was about coffee and the extent to which climate change is impacting the coffee industry or coffee production in Central America. I don't have any great, like, up-to-date information necessarily to share with you, but I can confirm that the impact is quite heavy and is growing. And so primarily the impact is on Central American coffee grown in the highlands, where precipitation levels are becoming increasingly unpredictable. The impact is less somewhat in Brazil, which hasn't faced quite the same amount of problems. And of course, in Brazil, coffee is much more mass produced. And so there's just, when there are natural disasters in one place and a farm gets wiped out, the Brazilian coffee industry doesn't notice. In Costa Rica, when 10 farms get knocked out by a hurricane, the entire industry is impacted.
What is the trend in population in Latin America? And how does that affect everything? And you get really touchy about what is the role of the church?
Oh, interesting. Yeah. So the overall population of Latin America is still growing. It's not growing at the same rate as sub-Saharan Africa, but it's growing much faster than the United States and Europe, where the population is actually declining. As for the role of the church, what you don't know is that I wrote my dissertation about the Catholic Church in Latin America. But the short answer that I can tell you is that one of the most pronounced demographic changes in the last century of Latin American politics and demography is the mass movement away from the Catholic Church. Right. The Catholic Church has a lot of, like, kind of traditional power and authority, but not a lot of real human mass power and authority in the way it once did. And in a way that we're still trying to come to grips with in terms of understanding the relationship between religion and politics in Latin America. But yeah, it's so what I would say is, well, of course, the Catholic Church has an impact on some folks' decisions about family planning. Each year, the influence of the Catholic Church in Latin America declines just a little bit more.
A quick answer to Judy's question: the Carbon Disclosure Project grades companies based on transparency regarding climate impact.
Thank you very
Look it
much.
up and take it. I mean, that's all I know. So I'm not recommending it, but I thought I'd look it up and give you something.
Thank you so much. Carbon Disclosure
Project.
Carbon Disclosure Project, a recommended Google search, but not yet a recommended organization. Thank you.
Any industries that were really active in the Paris, agreement that might put their thumb on the scale here in the United States to kind of push us forward on this?
That's a great question. I mean, but to the extent I can answer it, I don't think it'll be anything beyond the obvious. But I mean, like, the solar industry, renewable energy industries, like, they have everything to gain from an increase, a renewed commitment to the Paris Accords, and also heavy investment from countries in the global north in countries in the global south who need to spend money on that stuff too. That's the thing about the climate accords, the Paris Climate Accords, is that $300 billion is money not just about, like, recovering from hurricanes, it's money about transitioning to greener economies everywhere, including the global south. And so one would think that industries focusing on renewable energy would be the loudest, strongest voices in the conversation pushing for a renewed commitment to the union. Thank you for the question. Sorry, no wisdom there, but thank you for that.
So as you're talking about moving from rural to urban, a lot of those people are supplying the food. So what's the effect there?
Absolutely. So, I mean, presumably what we would see is a classic change in like labor dynamics, right? So if people can't survive in rural areas, and they're moving to urban areas, then we have a diminished workforce in those agricultural areas, which would mean higher wages, potentially, which would be higher prices, potentially, for that food that's being produced, meaning the cycle comes back to higher cost. Now, that is a few logical leaps too far, frankly, right? But the notion that a changing labor pool in rural areas will put political pressure and economic pressure on whoever owns that arable land would be undeniable, would follow like it would be like the law of gravity, it would follow.
Talk a little bit about farming, if you can, in Central America. Are they still small farmers, or have they moved into larger farming mechanism?
The first part of your question, I didn't quite catch.
So, smaller farmers, they have small farms versus larger farms that we have in the United States.
Got you. Yeah. So the question is about farming in Central America and the sort of like relative maybe position of small farmers versus larger agribusiness. So Central America, I can speak most directly in to like the coffee industry. Surprise. And in the coffee industry, Central America has, particularly in Costa Rica, but elsewhere too, developed a lot of like niche production operations where relatively small land holdings owned sometimes by a family or by a local cooperative can really thrive in that environment by selling to coffee drinkers in the United States who are willing to pay a premium for boutique coffee where they know where it came from and it tastes exotic or whatever. So in Central America, like that is a very real thing. It's really, really promising. There's of course also an agribusiness presence there, but the large agribusiness doesn't drive the whole industry.
I basically asked the same question, but so in this country, family farms, 19th century, whatever, now agribusiness. How about the staples in Latin America, corn, soybeans, so forth? Is that still largely small farm or?
That's largely large scale agribusiness. And those staples primarily are coming from Brazil and Argentina. And there it's a radically different situation where we're talking about a very US style situation of mass production.
Yeah, I was thinking about the slides that you had on earlier with the, heavily impacted housing on hillsides. Where are those slides from? Are they from where? El Salvador or where?
Those photos were from Brazil.
From Brazil.
Those are some relatively famous photos of favelas in Brazil.
Yeah.
But each, I was kind of checking myself today, getting my presentation ready to make sure I wasn't just telling a Brazil story in talking about favelas. And what I learned today is that each country of Latin America has its own specific name for hillside slums. Because it is such a widespread urban phenomenon, but it's very culturally specific.
So just a little follow-up question. So on a hillside heavily impacted with ramshackle housing like that, or in some cases, decades of generations of families living, on those hills. So there's got to be projects out there that are going to empower and train the local folks to be ready for heavy water impacts, right? Reducing erosion, reducing the possibility of landslides. How do you impact the drainage systems? How do you create a drainage system by training the locals?
Mhm.
And are you aware of any of those?
Not only am I aware of them, Brazil, so the idea I'm gonna share with you is an idea that has, if I'm being honest, been on the decline since the Bolsonaro era, right? So roughly the last decade. However, Brazil has a multi-decade long now tradition of experimenting in some urban areas with a process called participatory budgeting. And participatory budgeting refers to this strategy for figuring out how to disperse city revenue to low-income areas. So that rather than the city government saying, we are going to spend $100,000 on a sewage system at this intersection. Instead, the city says, favela, we have $100,000 for your neighborhood. You decide how to spend it. And then communities learn and then practice how to have direct democracy style, hyper-local community meetings where they sit down, they make the budget, and they decide exactly what their highest priorities are. And there have been experiences of great success using that model, and also some of failures, as one might expect. But I mean, I'm inspired by it, not because I'm confident that that specific process can work like around the world and be replicated, but that's the kind of really new, bold thinking about the relationship between people and government and the environment that our time calls for.
I mean, I was thinking when you were showing those slides too, like, you were saying how the lower houses were there longer, so they were building up their bricks and their foundation, but I would almost be more concerned about the new ones, because the landslides are gonna then come down and crash on them.
Absolutely, yeah. The higher you go, the more reason you had to be fearful. And
But the lower people being fearful too.
exactly. And the perverse beauty is the metaphor that creates for climate change. In that we might feel safe through our privileged position,
Right.
but we are so dramatically intertwined, there's no place to hide.
It's all coming.
It's gonna come down.
Thank you, first of all, for the presentation. It was very nice to see a very, focused, thoughtful presentation. I'm curious, kind of a two-part question. One, do you have other venues then that you would share this? And then my second part, I know that you're a professor here, right? So how do the younger students that you share some of your work with, how are they responding? And how
Oh, that's so
engaged are
great.
they?
Thank you, that's a lovely question, thank you so much. The question was, when I make a presentation like this, like where else might it go, how does it get used? And then how might students, like at Cabrillo College, how might they react to this type of topic or this type of presentation? So primarily, I am always eager for community engagement in this way. And so I'll give this presentation anywhere somebody will listen to. But primarily when I do these presentations for you guys for like the last 4 years, I'm getting them ready so that I'm also going to take them to my students. And on more than one occasion, I've given the presentations to my students before I give them to you to get their feedback. That didn't happen this time, but your feedback tonight is going to be beneficial for my students in a couple weeks. As for what student sort of like reaction to this kind of topic, right? My students, and so I find my students incredible and inspiring. They are militantly committed to the issue of climate change. It is their future and it is urgent to them. My students also have a kind of optimism, right? They might feel angry and resentful about the hand that they have been dealt. Like, that's real. But the optimism that they still maintain that it's not over, that this isn't right and we can do something about it, is what gets me out of bed. Here and then here.
Yes, you started your remarks about sea level rising along the coast of Chile.
Mhm.
And they export a lot of fish.
Mhm.
The fish industry will certainly not be crushed by this.
Mhm.
They may find ways to improve that, at least for Chile. It won't help Central America.
Mhm.
But I think that there are things that we can look at, turning it around and say, but wait, it's not all bad.
Mhm. Yeah,
It'll change.
Yeah.
Dramatically and expensively, but there might be some silver lining out of it.
yeah, I think that's important to remember. I really appreciate that. Thank you. And the comment sort of repeating for folks on Zoom is this notion that part of the challenge of reacting to climate change is also looking for things that might not be climate dependent, might not be affected by some of the things that we're modeling in the climate we're expecting. What resources can we shift our attention and our capital to sustain us in an altered world? There might be opportunities out there, right, if we focus only on the problems.
So, again, sort of back to recent or yes, most recent occurrences in the news. I know a lot of your presentation was based on geospatial data. So data that's connected to countries, to locations, to things like that. And one of the things that has happened recently is that there has been a statement that DEI information that has been freely available on the internet to to US people would go down. But those of us in the data world are recognizing that more than that is going away or has disappeared for, maybe it's a glitch, I don't know. But it's, it's like census data just disappearing. And so I'm wondering, from your perspective, how much of what is, how much of what you do is based on data that may not be there, that then we can't talk about the problems?
Yeah.
And how do you address that with your students?
Oh, that's a good question. So the question is about changes in the availability of information, specifically data, sourced and housed by the federal government. In other words, websites disappearing in our current era, and then what that might mean in terms of bigger picture and my interactions with students. So, so it's real. It's not over. It is also not new. When in 2014, in the 2014 midterm elections, Democrats lost control of a majority in the Senate. When the Republican majority took over, that meant that the Republican majority gained control of all the Senate's committees, including the Senate Committee on Environment and Public Works, which is the primary Senate committee devoted to issues of climate change. Upon Republican, I'm not trying to go to the partisan place, but we kind of have to. When Republicans took over the majority in the Committee on Environment and Public Works, they installed as their chairperson Oklahoma Senator Jim Inhofe, who believed that climate change was a hoax, and literally wrote a book laying out his theory as to why climate change is a hoax. When Jim Inhofe took over that committee, the term climate change was completely wiped from every publicly available webpage for the Senate committee charged with dealing with climate change. Now, I know that's not the same as data disappearing, which is much more alarming. But I think one of the things that it speaks to is the need to find places going forward to house data safely and outside the control of government so that it can continue to be accessed for people who want to learn from it.
In the Western Hemisphere, we've got us going isolationist and severing ties and any sense of responsibility to the world at large. What about the other countries in the Western Hemisphere and their governments? Bolsonaro seemed to be sort of in the same camp years ago. What about the other countries? What are their governments like?
That's interesting. So across the hemisphere, in terms of bigger geopolitics, I think the one thing I'm most focused on, and a lot of other sort of regional experts are focused on now, is that as the United States as the United States backs away from a leadership role globally or in the hemisphere, what that actually does is create a leadership vacuum to be filled by somebody. And most specifically, surprise, that is China. And China is now investing massive amounts of its own state revenue in the form of loans and in some case outright purchases of major infrastructure projects all across Latin America, including things like ports and airports. In a way that the US deciding it's going to be more isolationist, for lack of a better term, is handing a gift to China, and that gift is influence in Latin America.
On a personal note, how are your students?
How are they?
Yeah.
Thank you for asking that question. Thank you. The question was just, how are my students? Let me answer that question two ways. How are they? They're amazing. I've taught at different colleges and universities around the country my whole career, and I've been in Cabrillo 10 years. And I tell people all the time, my students at Cabrillo are the best students I've ever had. They care, they are plugged into the community, and they are so smart. Yeah. Also, how are my students? Incredibly anxious, incredibly worried, and very distracted. Distracted not by things that don't matter, but by the things that do. Like figuring out how to afford to live here, figuring out what their future is and if it can even be here. And you know, I find a lot of my job right now is is being a teacher, but also just being there with my students. Somebody to listen, just to be somebody to listen. Thank you. Okay, folks, thank you so much.